Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. As America is withdrawn from Afghanistan, the specter of leaving behind Afghan allies who risked their lives to aid U.S. troops has dominated much of the discussion, especially among veterans groups, and has drawn negative comparisons to the experience in Vietnam, when it was argued the U.S. facilitated the return of many of our Vietnamese allies and others who were in danger to the United States. In today's episodes of Horns, we explore this parallel more deeply by listening to Amanda Demmer, author of After Saigon's Falls, Refugees and U.S.-Vietnamese Relations. The story Demmer tells is more nuanced than the one in the popular narrative surrounding Afghanistan. She describes three large groups of personnel who came from Vietnam and Southeast Asia following the war, in a period after which America was very cool to the reception of refugees. But importantly, she argues that understanding the restoration of U.S.-Vietnamese relationships, and indeed, although she doesn't quite use these terms, understanding how it is that the United States came to process its defeat in Vietnam, can really best and perhaps only be understood by understanding the refugee story. Demmer is introduced by Mark Lawrence, an associate professor of history at the University of Texas Austin and director of the LBJ Presidential Library. This event was sponsored by the Clements Center at the University of Texas Austin. Let's listen in.
It's my great privilege to welcome everyone and to serve as host for this event. I want to start out by expressing a big word of thanks, of course, to the Clements Center, to Elizabeth Dowdy and others who had a hand in organizing this event. And thanks, of course, to everyone who's made time to join the program this afternoon. And above all, thank you to Amanda Demmer, our special guest. It's really wonderful to have her. Amanda is someone I've known for quite a while. I was just doing a little bit of research into when we first met. And it was back in 2014 when I had the pleasure of meeting Amanda when she was a PhD student at the University of New Hampshire, working on what struck me as a particularly promising dissertation about what I would loosely call the afterlife of the Vietnam War. She was interested in U.S.-Vietnamese relations and especially complicated questions connected to refugees that played out, of course, over the quarter century after 1975. It's been an even bigger pleasure to watch over more recent years as Amanda's career has just taken off in spectacular fashion. A couple of years ago, she landed a much coveted job in military history at Virginia Tech University, and I believe she's probably addressing us today from that campus. And most recently, I want to acknowledge and, of course, congratulate her upon the accomplishment that I think will be at the heart of the comments that she wants to share with us today. She has just published in 2021, After Saigon's Fall, Refugees and U.S.-Vietnamese Relations, 1975 to 2000, published by Cambridge University Press. This is obviously a wonderful accomplishment in its own right, but I have to say it's also extremely well timed given the amount of conversation, debate, discussion that's of course been going on now for several weeks in connection with the fall of Kabul and the obvious points of comparison to the fall of Saigon. I think she'll have a particularly large and energetic audience today, given the ways in which her already fascinating subject really echoes down to the present moment. Amanda, I want to turn it over to you, but not before one final word of thanks for making time to be with us. It's wonderful to see you.
Wonderful to see you too. Thank you. So I need to start out with some thank yous as well. Thank you, Mark, for that very kind introduction. I remember that coffee well back, seems like a different universe, pre-pandemic and pre-current job and my two children, so quite a while ago. And thank you as well to Will and Paul for having me today. Thank you to Elizabeth for handling all of our logistical, technical, all the nitty-gritty to make this happen. So thank you so much. And it's really my pleasure to have this conversation today. I'm really looking forward to it. What I'm going to do today is to start with some kind of big picture reflections, discussions about the book, and then I'll pull a few specific examples that I think that will hopefully illustrate some of the larger trends that I'm talking about. And then I'll end with some observations on Afghanistan. So this image here, which, as you saw on the previous slide, adorns the cover of my book. This is where histories of the Vietnam War written in the United States usually end. And this moment in April of 1975, the fall of Saigon, the collapse of South Vietnam, this is usually often even in the epilogues, or sort of receives cursory mention in the last part of books that end, often even in 1973, with the Peace of Paris Accords and the withdrawal of US combat troops from Vietnam. And so I decided to take this moment where histories of the war often, not always, but often end, and use it as my starting point. And so what I do in the book is I chart this trajectory from the photo on the left in many ways to the photo on the right, from the fall of Saigon to the announcement of the resumption of economic and diplomatic relations in 1994 and 1995. Respectively. And partially, before I sort of delve into this story, it's rather unusual. As Mark, as director of the LBJ Library, can no doubt attest, it's quite unusual to suggest that something about the Vietnam War is understudied, right? The Vietnam War being one of the most examined conflicts, events in American history. Partially, this has to do with the questions we've asked about the war. Given the costs for the United States in terms of lives, in terms of dollars, and so many other things, the question of why Vietnam, right? Why did the United States go to Vietnam in the first place? Why was this part of the world viewed as so important? And why did both Republican and Democratic presidents invest so much in this conflict? And that question, very important one, right, to ask, has inspired a huge body of scholarship about the war's origins, right? Sort of trying to uncover why we're there in the first place. And then the second question that has animated much of the scholarship in the United States is, how did the United States possibly lose, right? Given the relative military, political, economic, geopolitical power that the United States had in its arsenal during these decades, how is it that the United States failed to prevail? And these two questions have really framed much of our thinking about the Vietnam War. And so what I want to do in my book is to ask different questions and to shift our focus both temporally, but also thematically, as I'll get to in just a moment. So the central contention of my book is that to understand that 20-year period, that normalization period, we need to center refugee politics. And so here on this slide, I have just a very brief overview of the various programs and policies through which Vietnamese came to resettle in the United States after the fall of Saigon. So the first of these is approximately 130,000 evacuated alongside U.S. personnel in April of 1975. Those evacuees were technically parolees. Legally, that was the classification, even though they're commonly referred to as refugees. This has important links to what's happening right now with regard to Afghanistan. So I'm more than happy to circle back to that later on if you're interested. Another almost 500,000 individuals came from throughout Southeast Asia. These are the so-called boat people, individuals who decided to flee Vietnam, or in the case of ethnic Chinese, were often pushed out of the country in incredibly dangerous conditions, in vessels that were often not made for this type of journey. They faced pirates, they faced push-off policies. Oftentimes those on the shores they were trying to land did not want to receive them. And so these are individuals, in a word, who fled. Vietnam, right? Vietnamese who came to the United States, but from outside of Vietnam's borders. And there are big international conferences in 1979, and then again in 1989 that helped implement multilateral programs to address the Vietnamese diaspora. And then 10,000 more or so came in 1996, right? Note that date, mid-1990s, through a program called the Resettlement Opportunity for Vietnamese Refugees. And these were individuals that were among the boat people who had landed in first asylum nations throughout Southeast Asia, and then were sent back to Vietnam. The rover was a policy for them to apply one more time to see if they were eligible for resettlement in the United States. So we have the initial evacuees, and then we have 425,000 who came to the United States after having spent time in other countries, left Vietnam, then came to the United States. The third category, broadly speaking, is another 523,000 who came directly from Vietnam to the United States via a multilateral program called the Orderly Departure Program, the ODP. And this was a initiative that was created through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Resettlement, UN Refugee Agency. And the United States was not the only participant nation with the ODP. Other Vietnamese went to Canada, other went to Australia, but the United States was by and far the most significant participant nation in terms of numbers. And the ODP included some programs for Amerasians, that is the children of American men and Vietnamese women, and re-education camp detainees and their close family members. And so the ODP, right, is a multilateral UN facilitated program that also had bilateral subprograms, right? These subprograms for Amerasians and re-education camp prisoners were bilateral negotiations between the United States and Vietnam, as was the Rover program. And so what I wanted to do in my book was to really center to center migrants and migration programs, and to ask what we can learn about international relations when we put these types of issues at the center. And so the key argument I make regarding US-Vietnamese relations specifically is that normalization, right, the process of resuming economic and diplomatic relations and refugee resettlement, these were not merely simultaneous programs, simultaneous developments. They were mutually constitutive, right? Negotiating and implementing migration programs for South Vietnamese became, to a large extent, the basis of normalization between Washington and Hanoi. Negotiating and implementing all of these programs required contact, required compromise, required cooperation, including regular meetings in Geneva, in New York City, in Hanoi. And these are the types of negotiations that I really dig into in the book. So broadly speaking, I offer sort of a three-part narrative in the book, a three-part lens for understanding the U.S. approach to Vietnam. And I should be really clear on that point, actually, that the key thing that I wanted to do in the book, as I talk about in the introduction, was to uncover the U.S. approach to normalization. And so in part one, I argue the 5 years after the fall of Saigon, that these were 5 years of fluidity, of contention, of vigorous debate, whether or not the United States had an obligation to its South Vietnamese allies, what that obligation entailed, and how the United States should approach the government in Hanoi. These were all open questions for which U.S. policymakers offered divergent answers. Some suggested that the United States should normalize relations with Vietnam right away, without preconditions, and others suggested normalization was impossible under any conditions whatsoever. And so within these 4 or 5 years. As many of you no doubt know, right, we also, in addition to the Vietnamese diaspora, we have the outbreak of the Third Indochina War, we have US normalization with China. So a lot of really systematic regional and international changes during this era. By 1980, I suggest, so during the tail end of the Carter administration, this sort of wide open debate on the US approach to Vietnam coalesces. By the end of the Carter administration, the United States has tabled formal talks with the government in Hanoi on the status of official economic and diplomatic relations, and has declared that it is unwilling to even reopen those talks until Hanoi withdraws its troops from Cambodia and provides a so-called full accounting of missing American servicemen. These are U.S. Service members who had served in Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia that were listed as prisoner of war / missing in action. It's POW MIA. There's a lot of really great scholarship on that issue, and I talk about it in much more depth in the book. So for the most part, right, the 1980s, sort of the gap between those two pictures I showed before, have sort of been taken as, to use Cold War, right, parlance, frozen, right? Relations between the two former foes were frozen. There was no official talks on the status of relations. But what I do in the book is I sort of dig a little deeper. And I say, okay, for sure, right? Those things have remained at a stalemate in terms of the official status. But if we explore all of the negotiation on migration programs, the picture starts to look a little bit different. And certainly the early 1980s, the US adopts a very sort of combative stance, and much more broadly, of course, with Reagan and the re-energizing of the Cold War. But as you can see, the title of Chapter 3 is Expanding the US Agenda. And here's where the US broadens its focus to include not just the so-called boat people, but also Amerasians, re-education camp detainees, individuals who are still in Vietnam. And eventually, all of these issues, right, require Hanoi's cooperation if the United States actually wants to implement these programs. So during the 1980s, we see a lot of negotiation, a lot of compromise, and a lot of bipartisan support, a pretty shocking, actually, amount of bipartisan support for these programs, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. And then the last part of the book, part 3, which technically covers the years 1989 to 2000, but really focuses on 1989 to 1996. This is a part of the book where sort of things open back up again. And as we have systemic changes, once again, the international arena, I, of course, do not have to tell the audience what's happening to US Soviet relations at this time, but also very important internal changes in Vietnam in terms of Vietnamese leadership, that as the two nations move closer to economic and diplomatic relations, what US officials call humanitarian issues, which are, according to US officials, migration programs and missing American servicemen, that these issues continue to be at the forefront of US-Vietnamese relations. And what I ultimately argue in Chapter 6 is that the economic and diplomatic openings with Vietnam, of course, drastically changed US-Vietnamese relations in some regards, but in others, US policies are left intact as the United States continues to implement programs for South Vietnamese migrants predicated on a wartime understanding, right, of the special ties between the United States and South Vietnamese peoples. So this is a book that is very much a Vietnam War story, but is also about much more than the Vietnam War. And so for the students on the call, I invite you to think about the relationship between these 3 larger transformations and the story I'm telling sort of as an hourglass, right? So we have the reassertion of Congress and U.S. foreign relations, changing domestic and international refugee norms, and the intertwining of humanitarianism and the human rights movement, right? So all three of these important transformations, they're happening, broadly speaking, and they're happening in ways that are, at least initially, right, very separate from the status of U.S.-Vietnamese relations, right? So the top of the hourglass, right? These are broader transformations that are coming to bear, right, on the status of U.S.-Vietnamese relations. But what I argue in the book is that U.S.-Vietnamese relations also, in turn, right, the bottom half of the hourglass, it changes the way these larger transformations develop, contributes to these trends, and really leaves a profound imprint in each of these three areas. So I'll talk about the first one a little bit more today, but these are central aspects of the book that I'm happy to talk about a little bit more if anyone is interested. And so when I'm uncovering the story archivally, one of the things that really stood out to me, one of the things that I discovered I really had to do was that in addition to consulting presidential archives, I used the Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton presidential libraries and all of the sort of foreign policy agencies that are typically associated with U.S. foreign relations. But I also spent a lot of time in congressional papers and in non-governmental holdings, right, NGOs. And so in the book, I talk about these groups, especially members of Congress and NGOs, and the relationships they form as non-executive actors, right? When we think about U.S. foreign relations in the 20th century, especially, this is usually a White House-driven story. But after 1975, after years of being the issue, right, Vietnam is no longer among the top 5 national security issues with which any of the sitting U.S. presidents have to contend. And so for this and a whole host of other reasons, space opens up where other actors are able to, I argue, have a really important influence and leave a profound imprint on U.S. policymaking, right? So the proclivities of each president remain very important, as I detail in the book, but non-executive actors are really the ones who help create the momentum for a lot of these migration programs that I spent a little bit of time talking about. So let's talk about some specifics. 2 of the NGOs that feature most prominently in the book are the Families of Vietnamese Political Prisoners Association and the Aurora Foundation, organizations founded by Cook Minh Thuy and Janetta Sagan, respectively. And so these are both women who are born outside of the United States. Thuy comes as a refugee in 1977. Sagan had come a decade prior. Her story is very, very interesting. She's born in Italy. She's part of the resistance in World War II. She herself is detained and tortured during the war in Italy. She comes to the United States and goes on to become one of the most prominent figures in the U.S. human rights movement. I'm actually working on a book project devoted to using Sagan's biography as a way to talk about human rights in the late 20th century. So I'm happy to talk more about her. But what I want to focus on today is the Families of Vietnamese Political Prisoners Association, which I'll call the association just for ease of conversation. So let's talk a little bit more about this group. So the association begins in Cook Minh Thuy's living room in the late 70s, and at first as a support group, in Thuy's words, for women who have husbands, brothers, sons, sweethearts being detained in Hanoi's re-education camps. And what begins as this sort of gathering among women who are trying to navigate incredibly difficult conditions, being refugees halfway around the world from their families and advocating on behalf of their loved ones, all while enduring right? The separation from those loved ones. This group goes on to become one of the most powerful Vietnamese American advocacy organizations in the country. And there's so much I could say about the association, but what I'll highlight here is that it plays a huge role in what human rights scholars call the politics of information. Right, using the transnational networks among the Vietnamese diaspora, what the LA Times calls the Vietnamese grapevine, the association is able to accumulate information that U.S. government officials regularly acknowledge is superior to their own information gathering. And so what the association does, on the one hand, is provides lists like this to U.S. officials about those who are detained in Hanoi's re-education camps, lists which are incredibly valuable for multiple reasons. First, because Hanoi refuses to publish the list of detainees. And second, because for an individual to emigrate under the ODP, they have to have their name on American and Vietnamese lists. So if U.S. officials were unable to sort of advocate at the individual level, a lot of the migration wouldn't actually have happened. As you saw on the previous slide, the association also publishes bilingual newsletters, right? And many of these, the insides, sort of like a Rosetta Stone in a way. It's half in English and half Vietnamese. And these contain everything from poetry, written by those in the Vietnamese diaspora, to letters from US presidents and congressmen, to the inner workings of the bureaucratic requirements for immigration, right? These newsletters are a beacon of hope and a source of very important information for both Vietnamese families and US officials. So here we have Cook Minh Do with Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy at a dinner that the association hosts on Capitol Hill in April 1987. And this is the association's first dinner. They will host multiple events in DC throughout the late 80s and early 90s. And this particular one is attended by over 300 individuals coming from both parties, coming from Congress, members of the State Department, representatives from the executive branch. And at this event, Dole and Kennedy both speak glowingly about the association and its leader. And they both speak very passionately about the individuals that are detained in Hanoi's re-education camps. Many of them are were U.S. allies during the war, members of the South Vietnamese military. And these are individuals who are continuing, right, to pay the cost for the U.S. South Vietnamese loss in the war in an incredibly visceral way. As time goes on, the camps increasingly draw a comparison to concentration camps. Those detained therein have to do mandatory confessions. They receive very little, if any, medical care. They live on barely subsistence diets. These are incredibly gruesome living conditions that these individuals endure. And so this is a great example of this non-executive alliances that I talk about in the book. So the association is incredibly influential, but it needs the backing of US officials, right? All of that information, all of that advocacy isn't going to be able to compel the government in Hanoi to make any changes unless it receives stronger backing from US officials. So this is the dinner. The very next day, Kennedy and Dole, along with Claiborne Pell, co-sponsor a resolution calling on Vietnam to release all political prisoners, to allow for their immigration to the United States, and make sort of explicit connections between their willingness to do so and the ongoing status of US-Vietnamese relations. So multiple observations I want to make here. The first is that congressional advocacy takes many forms. So we have resolutions like this, which are in fact non-binding, right? US Congress cannot compel foreign governments to do it at once, as much as Congress tries, right? But the symbolic value of this is very high. When introducing this resolution, Dole argues the issue is nonpartisan and calls on all members of the U.S. Senate to support it, and they do. Right, the Senate passes this unanimously. Right, so for the Senate to be in lockstep on any issue is rare. For the Senate to agree unanimously about an issue concerning the Vietnam War and almost all other aspects is completely unheard of. And so the members of Congress, they help pass resolutions that U.S. officials then make sure the Vietnamese government receives, right, infusing these symbolic non-binding resolutions with the weight of U.S. government backing. They hold hearings, they write letters to the president and to SRV officials. They send delegations to Vietnam. Congress takes on a very robust role in the U.S.-Vietnamese normalization progress and with regard to migration programs. And so earlier on in the process, the members of Congress you have on the screen right now are very good symbols of the types of individuals who participate. These are individuals like Kennedy, who are deeply involved in refugee issues more broadly. Kennedy had been chairman of a subcommittee on refugees and escapees during the war. He had played a large role and was very important congressional voice behind the passage of the Refugee Act of 1980, which is a very important development that I talk about at length in the book. And then we have Claiborne Pell, whose father was the U.S. representative to the Nuremberg trials after World War II. So lots of individuals with connections to World War II and the Holocaust more broadly, such as Pell himself, who the younger Pell serves as vice chairman of the International Rescue Committee when Hungarian refugees come to the United States. So ties once again between legacies of World War II and refugee issues, and then Bob Dole, right, a veteran, and someone with ties to World War II. These are the types of individuals in the 70s and the early 80s, especially in addition, Rudy Boschwitz, a refugee who are serving in the Senate, Stephen Solars, others. They really are individuals who spearhead a lot of the congressional initiatives and congressional policies. As time goes on, things start to change. Those assuming leadership roles are mostly Vietnam veteran, right, including the men on the screen, who I'm sure required no introduction, John Kerry and John McCain. And so as over the course of the 1980s, as the U.S. public starts thinking differently about the Vietnam War, right? Reagan's kind of rebranding as a noble cause, and also start thinking about their military, now an all-volunteer force, and through very different ways than they had in the 1970s and before. And so I'm getting to sort of why the U.S. public starts thinking very differently about its military and about veterans in the book, relying on a great body of scholarship that scholars for me have produced. But with regard to U.S.-Vietnamese relations, what this does is it infuses veterans, especially Vietnam War veterans, in Congress with a very powerful form of political capital, right? Men who have served, and it is all men at this point, right? Men who have served, and especially men who served in Vietnam, they are able to speak about U.S.-Vietnamese relations the way few others are able to. Their service, in a way, even though many of them were of very different minds about the war when it happened, this sort of gives an air of credibility. And these are the individuals, right, that the U.S. public will believe when they talk about the Vietnam War, especially with regard to the fate of missing American servicemen, which is what Kerry and McCain are exploring in this photograph. So it's no coincidence that when Clinton announces the resumption of diplomatic relations with Vietnam in the summer of 1995, he's literally flanked, right, by veterans in Congress who had been working to further U.S. or bring U.S.-Vietnamese relations closer together. There are many not pictured, but who at the same time were working right for the opposite goal to try to thwart or apply the brakes right to U.S.-Vietnamese relations. So zooming back out to sort of where I started here, when we think about these two moments, 1975 and 1995, and what it takes to really get from one photo to the other, what I argue in the book is that normalization must be understood as a process, right? When we talk about normalization, whether it's regard to Vietnam or Cuba, right, we often talk about normalization as a moment, right? Sort of the announcement of diplomatic relations being resumed. This is normalization, and now normalization has happened. It's here. It's over. It's sort of, all condensed into this one moment. And one of my goals for this book was to reveal normalization as a process, a highly contested, very controversial process that in this case spans 20 years and remains ongoing after 1995 in various ways as well. Another key contention, which should be obvious by now, is that to understand the normalization process in this particular instance, right? So not just normalization more broadly, but normalization in this case study, is that we must center refugee politics. If we fail to do so, then we sort of miss all of those rich negotiations, collaborations, which had been happening in the late 80s or in the late 70s, throughout the 80s and into the 90s, where these were issues upon which U.S. and Vietnamese officials continued to meet, to continue to negotiate, even as the broader status of formal relations remained in stalemate. Thirdly, non-executive actors, right, are crucial to telling the story of the U.S. approach to normalization, why re-education camp detainees become an important part of the U.S. position, Amerasians, why these groups of individuals become so central to U.S. Policy, and frankly, the same thing with U.S. servicemen, right? The Prisoner of War Missing in Action Lobby, the League, which is the NGO associated with missing American servicemen, the League, the Association, the Aurora Foundation. These are all organizations headed by women, advocating on behalf of family reunification and human rights. And as I argue in the book, that's not a coincidence at all. Can talk more about gender politics if you'd like in the Q&A. But that when we think about normalization broadly and this particular instance, right, we have to make room for often unconventional actors as central players in the making of U.S. foreign relations. And finally, another thing that I didn't elaborate on too much today, but that these particular developments really have profound effects on domestic and international refugee norms, which I'm sure I'll talk about with regard to Afghanistan. But and also human rights, right? Human rights has become really a lingua franca of international relations in the 21st century. The reasons for this are both far above and beyond U.S.-Vietnamese relations, but are also deeply indebted to the way these U.S.-Vietnamese relations unfolds over this 20-year period that I trace. So let me check on our time here. Okay. I'm going to offer now just a few comments on Afghanistan, just to help situate what I'm sure will be more specific additional questions in the Q&A. Despite the Secretary of State's insistence, right, that Afghanistan was not a recurrence or a reverberation or an echo of Saigon, this is the example that has become the main reference point for understanding recent developments in Afghanistan. And before I talk a little bit about the similarities and why that is, I do want to honor the very, very important differences. So not only, right, are there huge differences in terms of geography, the vast cultural differences between Afghanistan and Vietnam, huge differences in the times that we're living in, but even very profound differences in my own area of expertise, which is regard to U.S. foreign relations, regard to U.S. policy perspectives. So there are many, many things we could talk about here. But to my mind, two of the most important differences to keep in mind are the following. The first is that in Afghanistan, we watched the simultaneous withdrawal of U.S. combat troops, the simultaneous conclusion of the U.S. military mission, and the collapse of the government with which the United States was trying to support. In Vietnam, as I already mentioned, we had that 2-year lag period where U.S. troops left Vietnam in 1973. And then we had the collapse of South Vietnam and the evacuation of Saigon 2 years later in 1975. And so this is really important for multiple reasons. But in the Vietnam case, many Americans had already regarded the war as over for 2 years by the time we're watching the evacuation and the collapse. Not the case with Afghanistan. A second really important difference that I want to highlight is in terms of the popular experiences of the war. So as Professor Lawrence mentioned, I'm a professor at Virginia Tech, where we have a very robust Corps of Cadet program. Many of my students are in uniform when I'm teaching, and all of my students, all of my traditional students, I should say, the United States has been fighting the war in Afghanistan for their entire lives. And at the same time, for many individuals, not for everyone, but the war in Afghanistan has been to a large extent invisible. Individuals have had to seek out information on Afghanistan, on the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. And I saw a statistic that the average yearly news coverage of the war in Afghanistan for the last 10 years among the major news networks was something like 26 minutes of coverage per year. So very, very minimally covered. And where it has received coverage, it has done so in incredibly partisan venues, So depending on your perspective, what you think about the war in Afghanistan, you'd seek out reporting about the war from different sources, which have a tendency often to confirm, what you think about the war already. In the case of Vietnam, those factors were drastically different. First of all, the war was omnipresent, for Americans at the time, on nightly news coverage, in the press, just sort of unavoidably, in a very pronounced way. And the Fairness Doctrine, which is a piece of legislation that expired in the late 1980s, the Fairness Doctrine required news coverage of the Vietnam War to be, quote, fair, to be what we might call today nonpartisan, And so, of course, that's not is an incredibly difficult topic, but in the 60s and the 70s, there were 3 major news networks, and their coverage of the Vietnam War, because of the Fairness Doctrine, was incredibly similar, that the discourse on the war, although many people had very different opinions on it, the coverage, was in a much more narrow fashion that we get today. And because there was not social media, there was not the internet, there was not the same type of on-the-ground reporting and contrary positions that are so immediately accessible to us right now. This was not the case with regard to the Vietnam War. So there are many, many differences. Those are just a few that I think are among the most important when situating how the U.S. has experienced the conflicts and how the U.S. public has reacted to the collapses. Nevertheless, the comparisons continue. And one of the reasons that they do is because of the imagery. the imagery coming out of the Vietnam War and Afghanistan, for many who were witnessed the collapse in Afghanistan, or the collapse in Vietnam live, who are alive as that happened, has been incredibly eerie. Right. So here, the photo on the left is actually of Da Nang, not of Saigon. But the U.S. hovercraft, right, above the buildings, and a very humiliating, right, sort of admission of a hasty defeat and exit. Huge mob scenes at points of departure, with the obvious reality that all of the individuals who wish to leave are not going to be able to do so. These are among the most profound resonances, right? Why these comparisons are keep being made is that the images are so profound. Another obvious, right, point of comparison is that these are two unequivocal losses, right? Whether you supported the war or were against the war, in either instance, the reality that the U.S. government was not able to prevail is unavoidable. And so for the United States, this is not the narrative, right? We like to tell ourselves about the military and about U.S. power in the world. And so for this reason, the sort of visceral force with which to confront this failure in both instances is another reason that we talk about them collectively or comparatively. And two other points that I'll make that are not part of the public discourse, but are nevertheless, I think, important and instructive points of comparison are the following. And the first is that the relationship between the U.S. government and the refugee crisis. For time's sake, I'll point just to one, right? So in here we need to be careful because these complex situations belie easy analysis in a way. But in both instances, right, we have these conflicts that are occurring before the United States gets there. There's displacement, there's creation of refugees. But also in both instances, it is unmistakable, right, that U.S. involvement escalates the war, right, expands the war, the violence, et cetera. And so in both instances, we have not just the reality as these pictures demonstrate that many U.S. allies are seeking exit and seeking U.S. assistance after the U.S. withdrawal, but also the uncomfortable truth of the United States of not just a refugee resettling nation, but as a refugee producing nation, right? So in both instances, right, we have the U.S. conduct of the war, right? Wars as violence, as refugee-producing enterprises. So the United States as both producing, right, refugees as part of the war, and then, I guess, question mark, stay tuned on Afghanistan, but then as receiving countries thereafter, right? And the relationship between war and refugees and how we think of them as connected or not. So what I'll leave on this thought is that for one of my key contentions in the book is that we cannot end our analysis of the Vietnam War in 1975, that we have to continue it thereafter to have a full understanding of the conflict and its consequences. It is very tempting, right? For many, Afghanistan has already disappeared from the headlines to suggest that the war is over. For the people in Afghanistan, of course, it is not. So my book offers insight on the ways the U.S. responded to the expanses, the limitations of those ongoing ties between the United States and South Vietnamese peoples, what was done in this historical instance. The question, of course, today for policymakers is what might happen now, what can be done, and what should be done, which are, of course, questions for both the U.S. people and the U.S. public.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.